those attempts have been unsuccessful. Now, the stoning of the Jewish man and Jewish woman, I do not know whether it happened. But if indeed it even happened, then it happened according to the principles of their faith. Because as I said, it's in Leviticus. It's not in the Quran. And of course, they were Jews. And as I said, Article 25 of the Madinan Charter was clear that people who violate laws or commit crimes shall be punished according to the principles of their faith. So there's no way we can transpose a Jewish injunction or an Old Testament injunction onto the Quran. No. Now, secondly, no hadith justifying stoning has ever named a person who was so stoned to death. If you read all the hadiths on stoning, they just say a man, a woman was stoned. But I guess that people have had names since the creation of Adam. Indeed, Adam himself had a name. And so thereafter, everybody has had a name. There is not a single named person in these hadiths who was stoned to death. And I doubt that. So, because there are hadiths that are replicit with names of people, that Abu Fudail came to the Prophet and said, counsel me. And the Prophet said, pray, he said, I am busy and I'm unable to say the 5 daily prayers. And then the Prophet said, pray al-Asrain. And he said, what is al-Asrain? And he said, it is to combine the Zuhur and the Asr prayers. So people are named in hadiths in connection with their encounters with the Prophet. How come that on stoning alone, nobody is ever named? I just have my doubts. I'm just asking questions. My Professor Gaba used to say, I don't want an answer. Now, Ash-Shaybani's question to Abdullah ibn Awfa is germane. And I'm suggesting that even if the Prophet carried out the punishment of stoning, it must have been before the revelation of Quran 24 verse 2. Even if he did. I'm not saying he did. Kokubaku calls it what? Assuming without admitting. Let's assume that he did. It must have been before, because you remember that when the Prophet migrated to Medina, there were many practices of the Jewish people which he adopted and asked the Muslims to do, including even facing Jerusalem to pray, until a specific verse came and said, turn your face towards the Qibla, and then the Muslims turned, including fasting on Ashura, which the Jews used to do on the day of Passover. And then the revelation on Ramadan came, and then they stopped the Passover fasting. So I'm suggesting that perhaps because of these Jewish practices that he was doing, he must have carried it out. But after an explicit verse of the Quran is revealed, he must have stopped it. Now, I am coming to the character of the Prophet himself. And I'm saying that by the character of the Prophet that is written in the Quran, he could not have been stoning Muslims to death. The people that he had labored and suffered persecution in order to preach the faith and for them to abandon the polytheistic belief and troop to Islam, then he turns around and he stones them to death. I think that the character that Allah portrays of his prophet in the Quran is inconsistent with such callous behavior. This verse says, now has come to you an apostle from amongst yourselves. It grieves him. That Allah says it grieves the prophet. The prophet grieves that Muslims should perish. It's stoning to death, not perishing. That it grieves him that Muslims should perish. And that he's ardently desirous of Muslims. He's anxious about Muslims. He likes Muslims. And to the Muslims, he's most kind and most merciful. I am arguing that a very merciful and kind prophet towards Muslims would hardly stone them to death. Another one. This is a hadith. No, I'll come to the hadith later. This is Quran 48:29. It says that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the apostle of Allah, and those who are with him, Muhammad Rasulullah Ashidau al Kufari, are strong against the unbelievers, but they are compassionate amongst one another. The Muslims, they have compassion for themselves. Again, I'm arguing that having compassion for your fellow Muslim is not stoning him to death. Now, there's a hadith also in the same Buhari in which another man, again not named, comes to the Prophet and says, oh, I'm talking about the Umar one yet. I'll come to the man. But Umar, there's a hadith in Buhari in which the Prophet was sharing war booty. And a man got up and told the Prophet, be just in your sharing of the war booty. Don't be unjust. And then Umar rushed to pounce on the man. And the Prophet held him and said, let it not be said that Muhammad kills his people. It's in Buhari. I'm saying that let it not be said that Muhammad was killing his people. Stoning to death is killing his people. So if he has said in the same Buhari, so that means that even in the Buhari, we've seen the contradictions and the inconsistencies. Those inconsistencies don't exist in the Quran. So if I'm going to wager, I will wager in favor of the Quran, not Buhari. The Prophet telling a man that the punishment for his hard crime had been forgiven. Remember, I told you that hudud crimes are crimes whose punishments are explicitly stated in the Quran. In this same Buhari, in book 86, number 6823, a man comes to the Prophet during Asr prayer and said, Ya Rasulullah, I have committed a felony, a hard crime, even though he doesn't mention the crime. So inflict the punishment on me, because Allah says in the Quran, the punishment should be inflicted. And the Prophet said, let's pray first. So they go into the mosque, they finish the Asr prayer, and then they come out. And the man goes to the Prophet again and says, Ya Rasulullah, I want the punishment inflicted on me. And then according to the hadith, the Prophet said, did you not just pray Asr with us? And the man said, yes. And the Prophet said, you have been forgiven. I wager that the Prophet was on the side of forgiveness, not killing the Muslims. So, conclusion. My clear position is that punishment for adultery in Islam is 100 lashes of the whip, not stoning to death. There are many mujtahids who hold the same view. In other words, I'm not saying that I'm saying anything that is new. There are many people who hold that view as well, including the entire Ahmadiyya fraternity. Indeed, the Ahmadis have been at pains to keep writing and keep writing. I remember the late Maulvi Wahab Adam, the head of the Ahmadiyya fraternity in Ghana, may Allah bless his soul, wrote copiously in the press in Ghana, asking any Muslims who have real unimpeachable evidence that the Prophet was killing Muslims by stoning them to death to come forward. Until he died, I am not sure that I saw any rebuttal of his position. So I'm not saying anything new. But as scholars, they would Okay. So, like I have said, there are 4 sources of law in Islam. The Quran. And the Quran has the provisions, the stipulations of these prohibitions and the consequences thereof. Okay? Then, in the practices and life of the Prophet, okay, there are written accounts of how he dealt with these matters. Okay? And from those body of collections, the jurists, is what the jurists have classified into Hanafi law, Maliki law, Shafi'i law, and etc., etc. So the standards of proof, yes, they do exist, but they differ from one school of law to the other. So you will find that they may tell you that, for example, Saudi Arabia practices Hanbali law or Hanbali law, okay? Or they may say to you that Iran, for example, practices Jafari law. And for something that Jafari law may say should be for a period of, say, 2 years, Hanbali law could say 3 years, and etc., etc. So there will definitely be standards of proof, except, of course, like I said, in some of the nebulous laws like waging war against Allah and his messenger and so on. But in the Quran, for the purpose of Zina, which is what we are discussing today, it says that the standard of proof is that you must bring 4 people who witnessed the event. And that if it is not, if you come to say it by yourself, that this is what I have done, and you don't bring 4 witnesses, then you yourself should testify 4 times against yourself that what I say be true. Do you get the point? So there are standards of proof, but they differ from school of law to school of law. There's no uniform standard of proof.
All right. So murder, for instance,
Yes.
what will be the requirements? You say, Zina, you need 4 witnesses. What will be the standard that you need to establish?
Murder also, there would be almost like the same elements that you have in secular law, that first of all, there is a body. If there is no body and there is, I'll give a very typical example that happened in the international media very recently. If there is no body, but there's conclusive proof that nonetheless the person died, that there were perpetrators, you get the point. That would be a standard proof, that a body conclusively that the person is dead.
And the circumstantial evidence that links
somebody else to the death of the person. So a typical example is what I said made headline news in the world, was the death of the journalist Khashoggi. To this day, we don't have the Khashoggi's body.
The Turkish embassy.
Yes, and the Saudi embassy, in Turkey.
Yeah, in Turkey.
Okay, but we have concluded that he indeed died and was killed by agents of the Saudi government. That is why the Saudi government has proceeded to pay what the Muslims call diya, blood money, to Khashoggi's son, because they have accepted, they think the Saudi state is somehow culpable because it happened in their embassy and etc., etc. So those would be some of the proofs for murder.
All right. Thank you very much. So we'll open the floor now for questions. And I see a question here. The microphone will be brought to you. So if you can mention your name. I know the first one, but he should still mention his name before he asks this question. Is it working?
Thank you very much. My name is Kobal Teneka. My question is within the context of human rights. So the distinction that you have made and the justification that you have made, your contribution is essentially that the punishment for adultery will be 100 lashes instead of stoning.
Yeah.
But even that, if you sit waiting all the times in human rights issues, it will still be really a breach of human rights.
Absolutely.
And if you even sit waiting within your justification,
Do you want to take it one by one, or we should have a few more questions? Okay, so there's a question here. Yes. Yes, my lord. Yeah. For yourselves. That was Justice Isifu Omoro Tanko Amadou, a Justice of the Supreme Court of Ghana, who has joined us. So honorable, over to you. You have 3 questions to answer.
The man, you remember I admitted that your question is a difficult one. Okay. So, my difficulty with answering your question is that, yes, it's not in consonance with human rights, okay, to lash people. But that's how you call it, human rights. Okay. But in a Sharia court, they will be dealing with rights that belong to God. Because oftentimes in the Quran, Allah makes statements and say, these are the limits of Allah and do not cross them. Are you following me? So the rights that you are talking about, so it's according to Islamic jurisprudence, the act of zina, okay, violates the sanctity, okay, that God himself has placed around the sexual act, okay, and for that violation you should be punished. I don't know whether to say that it is okay to do that, but I'm just saying that if it is in a Sharia court where they say we are implementing God's law, and you know, in many of these countries like Iran, Saudi Arabia, and so on, they say that the fundamental law of the land is the Quran, and all other principles of governance emanate from the Quran. Okay, so for them, your human rights and so on do not matter to them. But in a secular society like ours, of course, it will be an aberration for anybody to be caned for engaging in what we ordinarily would call a to anywhere. Every interpreter approaches a text with his or her own subjectivities. There is no objective interpretation anywhere in the world. Yeah. Now, secondly, which people are authorized to execute this punishment? So, of course, that is why, that is why people say that the concept that Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and the rest are bandying about regarding their so-called understanding of jihad. People argue that the time for the promulgation of jihad is past because there's no central Islamic authority qualified to declare jihad. There's no such central authority. That is the argument. Because it was part of the ingredients for which jihad ought to be declared. That there must be a central and acceptable authority. So if the people determine for themselves that they are going to be ruled by the Quranic principles, as in, say, Iran or Saudi Arabia or in Afghanistan, the Afghan authorities, remember I've told you that the Prophet was at once the head of state, chief justice, army commander, all of that. So the Afghan authorities themselves, the Sharia courts that they have set out, will be the ones which will be responsible for judging this matter. Even in the case of Amina Lawal of Katsina, which I gave, it was the Sharia court in Katsina that determined that she should be stoned to death. And then you said also that if it is not carried out, then what happens? So remember, my topic says to repent or to die. And I have said that, well, not me, but in Islam, every sin is forgivable except encompasses his wrath. And therefore, I believe that even if it were not carried out, Allah will forgive. Now, will cameras suffice as witness? Of course they will survive, Justice Tanko. I'm very, my lord. Cameras will suffice as evidence. Remember that in this modern day, people even have, science has made it possible for Muslims to sight the moon using telescopic evidence, if you want. That there are powerful cameras that are able to penetrate the stratosphere, or whatever name they call it, in order to determine that the moon has appeared, even though we cannot see it with our naked eye. And Muslims accept that verdict, and then they go on and fast. So to that extent, science would be enough evidence. I remember some time ago, there was this viral, not just one actually, these viral videos of a young man in Tamale who was recording every sexual escapade that he had with all the multiple girls in a university for development studies. And the videos were all over the place. And I remember telling my wife, I said, as for this guy, on the day of judgment, Allah will not need to ask him any questions. Allah will present the videos to him and say, are you the one in these videos? The videos will be self-evident. You know, I remember making that joke when the videos were all over the place. So, to that extent, my lord, I agree with you that cameras will suffice as evidence. Because remember, my argument was that the threshold for that, for proving adultery is too high. 4 witnesses, I'm not sure we will ever get there. Unless, of course, God meant to just say, it is not your matter, leave it. Because you can never meet the threshold anyway. You know, that sort of thing. Okay.
So let's take another round of questions, starting from the back, and then we'll come here.
Thank you very much for the insightful discussion.
What's your name?
My name is Kenneth Eju. My question has to do with discretion. You mentioned that every offense is forgivable,
Islam.
except for one offense. And in criminal law, that would seem to suggest some discretion for the court and option to forgive. What would be the situation assess that this is a case where we should forgive,
And this is one that...
this is a case where we should improve? So my question borders on the considerations for that forgiveness, if that imply discretion and exercises that discretion on such a case, what I believe the Sharia court. Thank you very much.
All right. I think there was another hand here, and then there's one at the front. Oh, there are 2 at the front here. Yeah.
My name is Mustafa. Follow up to what the justice had. So, what about using cameras within the context of spy? Because you know that everybody sings. And then here is where somebody is sinning and he's hiding away from you, and then you dealing with whoever you are, hiding that and spy on this person. That also suffice as another for prosecution. My name is Yusuf Adekodik. Based on one of the answers you just given us, the amendment actually doesn't go in line with human rights. I would like to say that the description of Islam and Sharia we have in the Holy Quran is not embodied that the Prophet of Allah has done. That is, it is a nature from God Almighty upon which man is created, man is fashioned. That means whatever we get from the rule of Sharia should rather be in line with human nature. Then, with your statement, if we then agree that the law is not in line with human rights, won't it be accurate to consider that we might have misunderstood the ruling on armed lashes as others misunderstood the ruling on stoning to death? Because there is also the possibility that the injunctions in the Holy Quran is not just limited to the 100 lashes on Zina. There could be other things related, which I think we come across in the Holy Quran several times as well.
One more question and then.
My name is Rashid Musa. My question is based on the fact that we know every law in Africa has a spirit behind it. So the Zina and other laws that is being mentioned here. I believe the Quran certainly has a spirit behind those laws. And what will be those spirit behind the law? For which reason? Quran must prescribe a certain kind of punishment.
We will take these 4 questions and we'll come for a last round where there will just be a few questions and then we'll wrap up. So,
on the question of who forgives, I will read you the one on murder. Okay, I will read the Quranic stipulation verbatim. Okay, and it says, "Oh, you who believe," which means Muslims, "the law of equality is prescribed to you in cases of murder. The free for the free, the free for the free, the slave for the slave, the woman for the woman. But if any remission is made by the brother of the slain, or as it has been interpreted, the relative of the slain, then grant any reasonable demand and compensate him with handsome gratitude. This is a concession and a mercy from your Lord." So what happens is that when the case travels and the judge comes to the conclusion that indeed there was a case of murder, normally at the verdict, I don't know how you lawyers call it, the day that the judgment is being pronounced, relatives of the dead man or woman are supposed to be in court. And when the sentence has been passed, they are asked, according to this verse, whether this man is supposed to die because he killed your relative. For me, as the judge, I'm supposed to pass the sentence. But it is left to you to decide whether he should die or not. And if the relatives say you should be set free, normally that's when, as I said, they pay you what they call diya, or blood money, in lieu of the killing. So it is not the judge who does the forgiveness, it is the relatives of the dead person who exercise their powers to either forgive or to insist that the punishment be carried out. Okay. Now, spying. Mustafa, the fact is that the Quran prohibits spying explicitly and says that you should not spy on your brother. So if you plant cameras with the aim that your roommate has narrowed you, so because your roommate has narrowed you, you are going to plant cameras in order to submit it to a Sharia court as evidence of what he was doing when he narrowed you. His lawyer would argue that it constituted spying, and to the extent that the Quran prohibits spying, I'm sure that evidence would not be admissible. Okay. Then, human rights. You see, my brother, that's why in answering his question, I emphasized on the word human. Okay? So, as for humans, we shift our definitions and understandings of human rights all through the decades. Right now, the Americans are telling us that LGBTQRC plus is human right. But I'm sure it doesn't make sense to you. They are saying that polygyny is disallowed in America because the consenting adults who have agreed to go into a polygamous arrangement, they don't have human rights. But people who have decided that they will pursue what we believe to be unnatural sexual pleasures, it's within their human rights to so do. And so I said to him that I can only understand the limits of God's law. And we can continue to shift the goalposts as humans to fit our own comforts and whimsical desires. Okay, I am not by any stretch of imagination justifying those whimsical desires, because I disagree that LGBTQ plus Y is human rights. I disagree. Big time. I disagree with all the vehemence at my disposal. Are you following me? So I am saying therefore that whose human rights? When you say human rights, whose rights? Whose rights? American rights? Ghanaian rights? So human rights itself is contextual. What may be human rights to the people of Indonesia will not be human rights to the people of Sapelga, where I come from. I don't know whether you understand me. So that's why I said to him that it's a difficult question. I'm hard-pressed at answering it. So I'm not explicitly saying that 100 lashes of the whip is against human rights. In any event, God is wholly other than this earthly realm. So God's law is not human law. I don't know whether you understand. And so if God's law contradicts human law, fair, well and good. I don't know whether you understand the point. So don't misunderstand me to say that I am saying that 100 lashes of the whip is bad or questioning Allah's judgment. No. Because as for humans, they determine what they want to be right at any point. Do you know that in the 1970s, homosexuality was considered a disease in America, that people who were homosexuals, it was classified as one of the medical conditions. And then in the 80s, they expunged it. And then they have come to Africa to say that we should allow people to do that. So, as for me, this whole business of human rights, now they say we can't even whip our children. That is not human rights to whip children. Why is it not human right? What is it? Me, my father, the beatings my father gave me, I'm excited that he beat me, wallahi, because part of it is the reason I am sitting here today and I am Mustafa Habib. You know, my wife and then my daughter are in the room. I've been telling them the ordeal that I went through in the hands of my father, which has shaped me. But for that, I will be very wayward, because I have very rebellious tendencies. Do you understand?
We hope you've not been beating your daughter, though.
No. On the contrary.
Because that would be a problem.
On the contrary, she's been born in the age of human rights, so my hands are tied. Now, the spirit of the Quran. You see, there is a verse in the Quran that says, La yukallifullahu nafsan illa wus'aha. That, for me, is the whole principle that animates the Quran. Ease in our affairs, to make life easy for people. Look, even this cutting of hands. Those who have been to Saudi Arabia is a country I haven't visited before, because I haven't also done the Hajj. But people tell me that in Saudi Arabia, you can drop your bundle of money somewhere and go several miles and come and pick it. Nobody touches it. Because everybody is afraid that if you were to take it, your hands will be cut. Nobody would even pick it to go and give it to an authority to say, oh, keep this. They will just be kicking it until the person comes to pick it. So to that extent, it's made life easier. You can leave your door ajar. People won't come and harass you and so on. So really, I don't know where we have to make the balance between a very permissive society where we are talking human rights and everything is permissible versus applying certain rules and ensuring order. I don't know whether you understand. When our president said that he wanted to make Accra the cleanest city in Africa, I remember Ambassador, the one who was our ambassador to China. I'll remember his name. He's now Siga boss. I'll remember his name. Ambassador Edward Boateng said he met the Rwandan ambassador to China at a meeting in China. And the Rwandan ambassador said to him, your president in Ghana says he wants to make Accra the cleanest city in Africa. And he said yes. And he said he can never do so. Ambassador Boateng said initially he was upset. I mean, he was being nationalistic. What do you mean? If you've done it in Rwanda, why can't we do it? And he says, take time, take time. Will you take soldiers onto the streets of Accra to beat people? And he said, in Ghana, we can't do that. Oh. He says, then you can never make Accra the cleanest city in Africa. He says, in Rwanda, we beat people. We maimed people. We killed others to make Rwanda what it is today. So really and truly, what do we want? Do we want a disorganized, chaotic society, permissive, human rights, 350 radio stations, everybody knows everything and everybody is talking? Or we want a society of order where rules are applied and applied stringently? Decide. You have chosen permissiveness, human rights, and so on. Country broke or country no broke?
All right. So we're going to take. I was going to say something, but I won't say it. I'll say it later on after we are done, because we need to have a long conversation about some of your thoughts and your ideas. But
no, I'm not saying that.
Oh no, I get you. No, it's on the.
I'm just saying that you need to balance.
Yes. Yes.
You need to balance.
All right. So we'll just take the last question, and the last question, we have another distinguished personality who is in our midst. She is by the person of Professor Ngobo Emese, who is the Dean of the School of Law of the University of Bradford in the United Kingdom, who has joined us this evening for this discussion. Let's give her a round of applause as she asks her question.
Thank you very much, Dean. Thank you very much, sir. I think very, very, very interesting discussion. And what excites me about it is the jurisprudential questions that you dealt with. And in a sense, I can see all of the interlinkages between how we look at law and how we discuss jurisprudential issues, including the ground norm and all of that, and how you got that in the context of Islam. And that's where I want to stay, because I think, especially in terms of the last things you said about human rights law, perhaps we can have those conversations outside of here. But in terms of your discussion around how we determine, I actually have a few questions, but I'm trying to distribute it. One of the arguments you made was that the Quran itself requires that if a slave commits the same offense, then it is halved. I want to ask, is that limited to Zina, or is that verse applicable to other hads, to other felonies as well? And if that is the case, how do you then have in those other felonies? That's one question. The second question I want to just add on to that was the discussion around Zina itself and who is liable. Because a lot of the stories around that we hear are around adulteresses, but in your discussion, you seem to use the same provisions for both men and women. And I wanted to understand if there was a distinction between an adulterer, whether they are male or female. I think I'll just ask you two. Thank you.
To my phone.
Thank you.
Okay, so the verse that I quoted about half the punishment for a free person is specifically in regard to the punishment for zina. It's not in regard to any other. Okay? All right. So that is that. But I want to make a point that all the cases that you hear, indeed, in the international world, that the Taliban have sentenced somebody to die by stoning, the Sharia courts in Nigeria have sentenced somebody to die by stoning, it's all women. You never hear that a man is sentenced to die by stoning. Now, that is un-Islamic. The Quran is very egalitarian. Okay? And I'm going to quote. Okay, the principle of gender justice as enshrined in Quran 33:35. It says, verily, the Muslims, men and women, the believers, men and women, the men and women who are obedient to Allah, men and women who are truthful, men and women who are patient, men and women who perform their duties to Allah, men and women who abstain from forbidden acts, men and women who are humble, men and women who give the sadaqah, men and women who observe the fast, men and women who pray the obligational nawafil, men and women who guard their chastity, and men and women who remember Allah much with their hearts and tongues. Okay? It says that Allah has prepared for all of them forgiveness and a great reward. So you see that this verse has had pains to say men and women, men and women, men and women. The other day I was asking Imam Irbad, he's left. I said, show me any verses in the Quran that are gender exclusive. And he says, no, all the verses of the Quran are gender inclusive. So what it is that our patriarchal societies and the Afghan society is so deeply, inherently patriarchal that they twist these Quranic injunctions to suit their own male chauvinistic views. So what they say is that the reason they are always sentencing only women is that for women, the evidence is normally clear. You become pregnant. So if you become pregnant or so on, they say that one, they don't need any other evidence. But they say that in the case of the man, it is your word against his word, and you guys have not brought 4 witnesses to prove that the man engaged in adultery. So that's how come the men are always going scot-free. That's what they say. But it is not the spirit of the Quran. I don't know whether I have properly answered your question. In other words, I'm saying that it is a travesty of justice that all the people that you hear have been sentenced to death are women. That is not the spirit of Quranic law. The spirit of Quranic law is gender inclusive. That's the point I'm trying to make. And the evidence is 33:35, Surah Al-Ahzab. Are you following the point that I'm making? Then there was another question, right? Okay, those were the 2 questions you asked. So that's it.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa Abdul Hamid. Let's do it better. We can do it better for him. It's been an engaging conversation, and on behalf of the Gimpa Faculty of Law, I'd like to thank you for honoring our invitation and for delivering this particular lecture or presenting this paper of yours. Our time is up. It's already 6 o'clock. Students have to go for classes. People have to do other things as well. So we'll bring proceedings here to an end. There are some refreshments that we have in the foyer, so those of you who are interested can do that. I also need to remind you that we were being carried live on ABC News TV as well. So ABC News TV carried this event live as well. Thank you very much for that. So thank you all and have a good evening.